Hi, everybody. So my name is David Ferrándiz. I am a project match mentee for fall 2024. I have the pleasure of working with Professor Jose Maldonado in his Chicano Studies 2 courses, the Mexican, American, and Contemporary Society. And through Project Match, it's an opportunity, a program really to diversify the LA Community College District's 9 schools. So to increase the amount of faculty of color across their many different departments and disciplines. So I really have this wonderful opportunity to be shadowing Chicano Studies courses and to provide this lecture for you all. So I'm going to get right into it. I have already recorded a little bit of an introduction to myself, as well as a small little recap, connecting the topic of this presentation to the first 2 weeks in class with Professor Maldonado. So that is available at a separate link, and that video is about 14 minutes long. So in this video, this lecture is titled Chicano and Third World Studies, a Symbiotic Rise. And so in this presentation, I'm really going to talk about how Chicano studies and Chicano identity does not emerge necessarily in a vacuum by itself, independent of other peoples or struggles, but rather Chicano studies is part of a larger effort of oppressed peoples trying to fight and achieve equality, justice, and in this case, what we're going to understand to be self-determination. So I'm gonna pass over our prior knowledge since that's available in the last video, and I'm gonna jump into this next slide. So there's a photo on the screen. I want all of you to jot down, what do you observe in the photograph? Who do you see? What objects are visible in the photograph? When do you think this might be? Where do you think this may take place? Take about 15 seconds, little bullet point notes to try and understand and gather some more information about this photograph. What do you see? Wonderful. So we're starting with this photo because I think in many ways it sets the stage for our exploration of the Chicano movement, and in particular the Chicano student movement. So before we get to Mecha and Chicano activism in higher education spaces like colleges and universities, it all starts in elementary school, and arguably it starts before that in our communities, in the experiences of our parents and our abuelos and those that came before us. So what do you see in this photo? I see certainly some young children, maybe elementary, some elementary school age children. I see dark-skinned children, black children, brown children. And in terms of objects, I see tables, chairs. The tables have some type of placemat, maybe mugs, silverware like a spoon. Are they eating? But I see them doing something with their hands. Some of them aren't sure what to do with their hands, but others have their hands almost raised outward in a diagonal, looking at a flag, and the flag is of the United States of America. So what is it that these students could be doing, willingly or not? It turns out that this photo is actually from, this black and white photo is from Los Angeles elementary school. And it's taken in 1939. And at the time, all public schools are legally segregated. And so what does that mean? What does it mean for there to be legal segregation, especially in the context of schools? So what that means here is that it is legal, it is allowed that schools be segregated, as in different schools for different races of people. So, for example, in the Jim Crow South, um, Black students were not allowed to study in the same schools as their white counterparts. And similarly, in places like Los Angeles, across California, Arizona, New Mexico, basically the Southwest, we see this system of segregation continue to take place, especially segregating Mexican American students from classrooms of their white counterparts. And so this raises the question, are these Mexican American students receiving quality educations? And so it's this experience of segregation, and to answer the question simply, no, these students are not receiving the quality experiences of their white counterparts. And that speaks to the different histories that Mexican American and Chicano youth encountered here within the United States. So starting in the late 1800s, especially the big farm businesses, we can call it agribusiness, the owners or the capitalists um, created recruitment plans in order to bring over more cheap Mexican labor. And part of that recruitment plan was the offer of um, providing education to their children. And so the children of these migrant farm workers would be enrolled in US-based schools, but the education they were receiving was very demeaning, racist, degrading. And so this is the beginning of educational experiences of early Chicanos receiving education in the United States. But then in the early 1900s, you have new policies and new efforts being created on the part of school districts and even local and county state governments. And that is that these once foreign students needed to quote unquote fit in to American society. And so what we see emerge is a policy of Americanization of these foreign Mexican American children. So basically, Mexican American students that are speaking Spanish or indigenous languages, who retain ancestral and community customs, they would find that all of that wealth, all of that, what made them who they are, was completely unwelcomed and seen as a deficiency on the part of those children. And that in order to fit in and to improve American society, they needed to strip away who they were in order to fit in to an American mold. And so what we see these policies being thrusted and enacted onto Chicano youth is very similar to the policies we see enacted onto other Native American children. In particular, the 1887 Dawes Severalty Act pretty much actualized the very racist idea that the government and schools, they must quote unquote kill the Indian, save the man. And so by stealing Native American children away from their territories, their communities, forcing them into boarding schools where they would have to live and sleep and study and basically be exposed to extreme forms of cultural, physical, psychological violence. It was with the exact same purpose of removing the indigenous cultural aspects um, from those people in order to prepare them or better them for an American society. So we see that the origins of Chicano education, of indigenous education, especially when it's dictated by the governments, whether federal, state, or local, has been just different forms of racism that has shaped that. And so as students and their parents and larger communities began to really understand what was occurring, they realized that that did not need to, they realized that only that by coming together, they could push back and fight back. And so around the early 20th century, at the same time as Americanization, we see Chicano communities alongside other communities of color really turn to the courts in order to fight for civil rights advocacy and achieve more equality under the law. And so this history of segregation of schooling is very long, but there was a very important court case called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that basically stated that it was completely legal for schools to segregate on the basis of race and ethnicity. This court case stated that this practice of separate and equal schools was not unconstitutional and not in violation of the 14th Amendment. So basically, the Supreme Court said that it is more than okay to segregate and separate students on the basis of color of their skin, because according to them at that time, technically speaking, they were still receiving education, even though they were separated. Now, were white affluent students receiving the same type of education as Black and brown students? Who do you think had more resources? Whose schools had more textbooks, and who had more teachers, and who actually had buildings to be schooled within? The Chicano, the Black, the Native American communities understood very well that segregated schooling was not equal, and it was indeed very racist and dehumanizing. And so they initiated numerous court cases, such as Mendez versus Westminster in 1947, to really challenge the Plessy versus Ferguson court case and to lay the groundwork for a monumental Supreme Court decision that would follow a couple years later in 1954. And it was in Brown versus Board of Education that Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned, and that it was verified that indeed segregated schooling did not provide equal education. And so now that you have the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land of the United States, argue in favor of desegregation, do you think that it magically changed the conditions of students of color all across the United States? Are educational inequalities and racism over? One could hope. But did that actually play out? And so, despite that Brown versus Board of Education decision, the conditions of racism only evolve. And so Chicano youth within Los Angeles experienced multiple layers of this racism. For example, when they spoke Spanish in classes, teachers would belittle them, dehumanize them, talk negatively about their cultures, their lingo. The curriculum, the textbook, what they were forced to learn held no relevance to their lives as Chicano youth. And any time that they attempted to learn about their cultures or bring their community experiences into the classroom, they were met with disdain. They were treated as if they had no knowledge. And certainly from the level of teachers to the level of superintendents, the entire educational system worked to put down Latino Chicano students. And so it's in this moment that you have an important figure by the name of Sal Castro. He's a high school social studies educator working out of Belmont High School in Echo Park West, the Echo Park Westlake neighborhood of LA. And he himself has faced the discrimination of the US government. Both he and his family was deported at a young age from the US to Mexico around the time of the Great Depression. It was blamed that the economic crisis was accentuated because Mexicans were taking jobs. Where have we heard that before? And so there was a deportation campaign in which both Sal Castro as a young boy and his parents were deported alongside thousands of other Mexicans. And so Sal Castro is politicized, and he has seen the harm that the government has enacted across the decades. And now that he's an educator working with primarily Chicano brown students, he sees that most of his other faculty colleagues are complicit in that same racism that he experienced that alienated him from a child. But he saw that education should serve a higher purpose. And so through his leadership and through activating the leadership of his students, it occurred that in March of 1968, over 4 different high schools, including Belmont, Lincoln High School, Roosevelt, and one other in East LA, Wilson, I believe, they all coordinated walkouts, meaning that they would all at the same time at different locations decide to leave school. They were not sure what would occur, if the doors would be shut, if the police would be called, but they knew that they needed to walk out in order to protest the racial discrimination, inequality, and the Eurocentric curriculums that were tainting them and their experiences in LA schools. So you have over 10,000 students bravely walking out, unsure of what the outcome would be. These students are growing up in a very turbulent and charged decade of the 1960s, where the civil rights movement is unfolding before their very eyes. They're seeing acts of civil disobedience being carried out and led by folks like Dr. Martin Luther King. And so they realize that this civil rights movement that is decades in the making, right? When Rosa Parks refused her seat in 1955, when the entire Black population of Montgomery, Alabama decided to boycott the entire bus system, the segregationist bus system, and walked over 2 hours to get to where they needed in order to put pressure and achieve change against that racist bus system. These students are also paying attention to what's happening at home in the United States and realize that the civil rights movement is not just an African-American struggle, but it is a struggle of any ethnic group that is being oppressed. And so Chicano youth learn that lesson and realize the power they have and make that bold decision to walk out. And so when they walk out, are they listened to? Are their values honored, or rather are their protests being cared about sincerely, and is the administration of the schools really trying to figure out how to be better? The immediate answer is no. When students walk out, they're met with fierce police repression, as this image shows. High school students being met by the police, and despite that repression occurring on the very first day, students make the decision the next day and the day after and the day after that, ultimately for 2 weeks, to walk out of their classes and essentially boycott, to refuse to participate and attend a schooling system that actively erases and harms their cultures and their identities. And so what we see in the East LA walkouts, what folks also call the blowouts, is that this kickstarts the Chicano student movements, which really will, these high school students, as they leave high school and seek to enter higher education, whether it's colleges or universities, they're seeing that there's very little opportunity for them to actually make it into colleges and universities. So they begin demanding equal opportunity programs, and they begin thinking about what does it mean for Chicano students who are deprived of an education to really bring education into their own hands and affirm their community's experiences. So following this very radicalizing experience of the East LA walkouts, the blowouts, a group of students, school administrators, and teachers formed the Chicano Coordinating Committee on Higher Education. And this was essentially a network to pressure the adoption and expansion of equal opportunity programs in California's colleges, particularly because colleges and universities were sites for white people to attain higher degrees. Universities started above all as sites for the elite, the not your poor whites, but the top of the crop whites to basically achieve a high education and reproduce this hierarchy of white people, of wealthy white people at the top. Access into colleges began to change with the GI Bill after World War II, where we started to see more white people, more middle class and poor white people given the opportunity to receive higher education. And these were veterans coming back from World War II. So in a way, the demographics of the college and university space at this time is changing, but it's inclusive of different classes of white people, and people of color still are being denied the opportunity to achieve a higher education. So paying attention to that, the Chicano students that were so mobilized by the East LA walkouts, they continue organizing, they continue meeting. And so 150 Chicano youth come together in Denver, Colorado in late March of 1969, about a year after the blowouts. And they put together what we call the Chicano Youth Liberation Conference. And it's here that a very crucial document, a manifesto of sorts, is produced called the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. And in this short 4-page document, these students agreed that the Chicano people are indeed a nation, an indigenous nation, who do not have access over their territory of Aztlán. And therefore, in order to achieve the education that they require, it means that they need to advance as a people through the creation of an independent political party by embracing what's called Chicano nationalism. And the goal is self-determination. And another way of thinking about self-determination is basically a people having the ability and the control to determine what happens in your community. So for decades, and indeed longer, indigenous people have lost control over what happens in their communities. The US government has stolen indigenous land, has forced indigenous people into boarding schools where they've been forced to lose their culture and a knowledge of who they are. And so there have been centuries of this erasure, of this violence. And so self-determination emerges as the goal. And Chicano nationalism is basically Chicanos understanding themselves as this is who we are. And so here's a snippet from the program of this plan. It reads, El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán sets the theme that the Chicanos, or La Raza de Bronze, must use their nationalism as the key or common denominator for mass mobilization and organization. Once we are committed to the idea and philosophy of El Plan de Aztlán, we can only conclude that social, economic, cultural, and political independence is the only road to total liberation from oppression, exploitation, and racism. El Plan commits all levels of Chicano society, the barrio, the campo, the ranchero, the writer, the teacher, the worker, the professional, to la causa. So in many ways, this is a rallying cry for Chicanos of different classes, the very few that have achieved the professional class, to then the middle classes, the teachers, the workers, to the farm workers, to really understand the unity and the commonality that brings them together, and the need. Unity doesn't just exist on its own. This is a call to unite as a Chicano nation, to mobilize and organize. And so while this conference occurred in Denver, Colorado in March, the students, Chicano students, are so activated by what is unfolding in their communities across the United States and also the world, that they continue to meet, this time at UC Santa Barbara 1 month later. And it's here at UC Santa Barbara that they really begin connecting dots and building upon this call to action that Plan That's Land represented. So we already touched a little bit about what was happening in the United States. We talked about the civil rights movement that's really been ongoing, especially since 1955, in which African Americans are proclaiming their rights to equality and inclusion within the United States as citizens, not as second-class citizens, but as full citizens with protections. At the same time, you might have what folks call a split within that civil rights movement, and you have the emergence, not quite a split, but another form of protest, this time of, say, the Black Panthers and folks like Malcolm X. The Black Panthers being a Black power group that argues the need for self-defense in their communities. They're operating out of Oakland, Bay Area, California, but they create chapters in Los Angeles as well. Their base was over on Central and 43rd Street in South Central. But here you have now, whereas you have Dr. Martin Luther King demanding equality and inclusion into the United States, you have the Black Panthers calling for revolution across the world and seeing the experiences of African Americans in the United States as connected and inextricably linked to the struggles of people of color across the world who are engaged in revolution against colonizers. And so 1968 is a really pivotal year because you have the civil rights movement, but also it was Martin Luther King that was assassinated here. You have the rise of the Black Panthers as well, and they're organizing the Bay Area in Los Angeles. But then globally, you continue to have the Vietnam War, but you have the Tlatelolco massacre of students in Mexico City. That was a very shocking moment for Mexicanos and for Chicanos to see, wow, this is really what our government is capable of. They're capable of systematic massacre and cover-up. So the 1968 student massacre at Tlatelolco was very shocking and revealing about the need for change. But similarly, you had a month and a half of riots in Paris, France, that was basically French people, French workers, French students protesting the conservative right-wing governments, calling for an end to imperial wars, because France continued to be involved in a war in Vietnam that the US was sending out soldiers to fight in. And so you have Paris, France becoming a site of rebellion as well. And returning to the Latin American context, we know about how powerful the Catholic Church and institution has been across the Americas, and even at a personal family community level. The church is a very protected institution in our communities, and it basically tells us how we need to live our lives. What you see in 1968 is Latin American priests coming together in Medellin, Colombia at the Second Episcopal Conference. It's called the Medellin Conference. And at this time, these priests are coming together and saying, what's the situation of your people? Well, my people are hungry. My people are do not have access to education. My people work so hard, but they are not able to survive. They're not able to earn money. My people are struggling. And they come to church. We talk to them about the Bible, but their conditions are of suffering. and they're suffering so much, and we tell them to aguantarlo, to take it, just be a good person, because when you die, you will go to heaven and everything will be better. But these priests were coming to a point where they said, why do so many people need to suffer? And the suffering of our people is not inevitable. They are suffering because the governments in power, the oligarchies, the powerful families, they are the ones that created the society. They're the ones that retain all the land and they do not pay their workers enough to survive. So the suffering of the people is not natural. It is created by their selfishness. And so these radical priests who met in Medellin were beginning to challenge the role of the Catholic Church for the past 500 years. And what they called is for Jesus's teachings in the Bible to be reinterpreted in service of people's struggle to create change in their societies. And that meant them actively encouraging their people to be critical of the landowners, to be critical of the political leaders, and to fight back. And so this movement could be called liberation theology. And there were many liberation theology priests throughout Latin America, South America, but especially Central America. Just in El Salvador, you have Rutilio Grande and San Oscar Romero, who really embodied this call for liberation theology and whose words inspired hundreds of thousands to rise up, to first think about their situations, to become critical of power, and to fight for social change. And so all this is happening as a result of 1968. And so basically, the Chicano students meeting at UC Santa Barbara are naming these connections. They're asking these questions. They're paying attention to their local situations as a Chicano nation, but also to the struggles of other communities, both across the United States and across the world. And so building on the Plan Natslan, these students create a 155-page document called the Plan de Santa Barbara. And pretty much it's a radical proposal that combined education, research, and political consciousness with the objective to empower and break open a pathway towards higher education for the generations to come. And so since the East LA walkouts, students, Chicano youth have been continuously meeting in Denver, Colorado, now in Santa Barbara, and they've been floating around this name, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. It's here at Santa Barbara that they consolidate that name and they take it and use it to represent their organization and their demands. So this it's through this process of Chicano student activism that we see the creation of Mecha, which is going to continue to play a massive role in the decades to come. And so these youth are paying attention to the very specific experiences of their peoples, the Chicano peoples, but it's also happening in relation to the world around them and to other communities fighting for change and fighting for justice. And so a big issue affecting Chicano youth, in addition to racist schooling experiences, is the draft. And so the draft refers to compulsory or forced recruitment of US citizens to fight in foreign wars. And so the Vietnam War was the last time that the United States issued a draft. And the Chicano movement was hasta acá. They were absolutely fed up with the idea that their youth and Black youth would be sent to Vietnam, halfway across the world, to fight a colonizer's war, where if they went to fight, they would be forced to shoot poor Vietnamese peasants, or they would die in the war. And so the Chicano Moratorium against the Vietnam War is really a series of demonstrations between 1969 to 1971, where Chicanos and other coalitional groups would come together to oppose the different levels of violence that the Vietnam War embodied, both the forced recruitment of Black and Chicano youth in the draft. And then you had Chicanos that would dodge the draft. And then they're calling out this imperialist colonial war that the US is fighting in Vietnam to stop the spread of communism and basically defending France, because France's colony, Vietnam and Indochina, was under threat because the Vietnamese wanted to get rid of the French so that they could actualize self-determination for themselves. And so the Vietnamese struggle was led by a leader called Ho Chi Minh. And so this is an issue connecting the local to the global. And so I want to read a quote by Corky Gonzalez, a prominent Chicano youth activist, about the Chicano Moratorium. So Corky Gonzalez wrote in an address, "My feelings and emotions are aroused by the complete disregard of our present society for the rights, dignity, and lives of not only people of other nations, but of our own unfortunate young men who die for an abstract cause in a war that cannot be honestly justified by any of our present leaders." And Rosalio Munoz, another Chicano activist, wrote in his Chale con el Draft. He says, "Today, the 16th of September, the day of independence for all Mexican peoples, I declare my independence of the selective service system. I accuse the government of the United States of America of genocide against the Mexican people. Specifically, I accuse the draft, the entire social, political, and economical system of the United States of America of creating a funnel which shoots Mexican youth into Vietnam to be killed and to kill innocent men, women, and children, and of drafting their laws so that many more Chicanos are sent to Vietnam in proportion to the total population they send off their own white youth." And that's an important point. White youth are not being sent to Vietnam at the same rates that Chicano and Black youth are. So the Chicano Moratorium is especially important in terms of linking the Chicano movement and the struggles of Chicanos to that of other oppressed peoples, such as the Vietnamese, who are bravely fighting for self-determination and to rid themselves of the French, who feel entitled over the Vietnamese land, resources, labor. And so while the Chicano Moratorium was a series and a widespread of different actions, there was one day in particular that proved especially unique, and not in a good sense. The day was August 29th, 1970, and there was a march convened off of Whittier in East LA at Belvedere Park, I want to say, or I want to say Belvedere Park. And at this march, you had over 100 different Chicano and allied organizations all come together to say US out of Vietnam, no more Chicanos being killed for an imperialist war. This day represented one of the largest assemblages of Mexican Americans ever. So the power was unmatched. The power of Chicano peoples was unmatched on that day. And yet, the power of police repression stained a very powerful occasion. Because so many Chicanos came out on that day, the police came out as well in order to repress the protest. The police fired tear gas canisters at the protesters. One of those tear gas canisters actually struck very important, renowned Chicano journalist Ruben Salazar on the head, killing him. Two other protesters were killed as well by police violence, and over 150 protesters were arrested on that day. So the Chicano Moratorium is a very powerful expression of Chicano discontent with the state of affairs of the US government, both against Chicano peoples, but building this critique of anti-imperialism. And it's to there that I want to turn, because here we're focusing on the rise of Chicano studies. But my argument, and I think what we need to, how we need to frame our understanding of Chicano studies is that Chicano studies does not emerge in isolation from other struggles, but rather it emerges within other struggles across the US and across the world. And that's what we call third world studies. So now we're going to pivot a bit in our conversation and think about what are the ideologies at play during this period of time. And so through the organizing work I myself do in the community, we're introduced to this term called coyuntura. And coyuntura also can be translated to conjunction, or kind of like it can be thought of as, say, two bones and where the joints where they connect. So it's different forces, different energies, forces occurring within the world that meet at a certain time. And so we did already a coyuntura of 1968. What were the different forces at play in that year? But we can also take a broader approach and think about what are the forces and ideologies at play during this time of the 1960s. And so we already mentioned Vietnam. And so what we're looking at here is a map of in 1938, the different colonial possessions of different countries. And so in the legend at the bottom left, we see, for example, France in blue. So if we think France, we think, okay, it's a European country. But then where else do you see blue on the map? Where else do you see blue on the map? Well, I see purple up here that represents Russia or the Soviet Union. It's got a lot of different countries. But when I see blue here in what they call Indochina, or Vietnam, Lagos, Cambodia. And I also see blue over here in Western Africa, in Algeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone. And so if I look at, for example, Spain, I see Spain has this little bit here in the Sahara Desert. If I look at Belgium, another tiny European country, huge mass of land that includes the Congo and the Central African Republic. If I look at Italy as well, I see they have Ethiopia. So what we're looking at is a map of colonial possessions from 1938, barely the onset of World War II. And what we see is that it's mostly European powers, the UK, Portugal, having Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde. It's mostly European powers that have taken a very small amount of land relative to the rest of the world that somehow has established government systems across the world and is therefore through this system of colonization recruiting and taking away valuable resources from these territories. So what type of resources are we talking about? Well, in Belgium, for example, who colonized the Congo, King Leopold II implemented a completely fascistic regime where he would force the native Congolese peoples to extract rubber, which grow on trees, to tap rubber. And that rubber was extremely profitable, especially with the rise of cars at the time. And so it begs the question, why is King Leopold in Belgium? Why is France in Western Africa? Why is Portugal also in Southern Western Africa? Why is Europe in Africa? Why is most of the world divided and owned and ruled by European colonial powers? And so the answer here lies in 1884 and the Berlin Conference. In 1884, the European empires of that time did not get along at all. They were on the verge of war. They had territorial disputes themselves over where the border lines begin and end between themselves. And so the Europeans preferred not to go to war with each other. And so instead, they all decided to carve out and scramble for Africa. At the time of the late 1800s, that's when they were beginning to send different explorers such as David Livingstone into the center of Africa to map out the rivers, the Nile River, see where it takes you, see who you meet, in order to understand what's there, what could we gain by establishing a foothold there. And so in 1884, these European powers all meet in Berlin, Germany, and decide to carve out Africa. So after 1884, only 90% of Africa remains for Africans. And it's in this period of colonialism that so much wealth is extracted from Africa, and that is going directly to Europe. And this is completely through unpaid labor of Africans. So we're not talking about like chattel slavery of slavery from Africans into the Americas or into the US, but this is happening after slavery was made illegal. And this is a way of Europe maintaining its power and also increasing its fortunes. So what we can call a global struggle for decolonization, therefore, is the efforts of these once nations and once peoples to rid themselves, to get rid of the colonial occupiers who steal the resources from across the African continent and places like Vietnam, who use cheap or free labor in these countries to grow rich. And so they are seeking to get rid of these colonizers who in actuality are more like parasites, who rely like insects and parasites that attach themselves to you and suck out your blood, suck out your resources, and leave you sick and dying, but so that they can survive and thrive. And so you may be wondering, most of the color on the map is within Africa, Central Asia. You got India there. But why is Latin America gray? Does that mean that Latin America has no formal colonizer? Well, we know that the two main colonizers were were Portugal that colonized Brazil up until the 1890s with like Emperor João. And then you had most of South America, Central America carved out by the Spanish. You had a little bit of English and Dutch, the Netherlands involved, but for the most part, it was the Spanish that colonized Mexico, Central, South America. And so Mexico was the first country to overthrow the Spanish in 1810, and then it led to a series of revolutions across South America that then began to overthrow the Spanish in places like Argentina and Chile, and then Gran Colombia, and then Central America. So you had the Spanish losing power and losing their foothold, and what you see is the rise of a new class, where for the first time these countries are, in theory, politically independent from the Spanish, much like the United States got declared independence from Great Britain. But what we see is that in the decades to come, from the 1820s, even up until the 1920s, what you see is that the people that are leading those countries, the great majority of those still have ties to Spain, are still reproducing the colonial relationship of the caste system, where white European descended peoples or the more adjacent mestizo peoples are able to receive greater privileges. And so therefore the dark skin, the indigenous, the black peoples continue to endure the same set of colonial relationships that defined the colonial period centuries before. So it begs the question, yes, Latin America technically is free, but what we see emerge has, some folks call it a coloniality of power, where even though you're now post-colonial, the colonial period ended and you're after that, the post-colonial is still defined and dictated by a coloniality of sorts. And this coloniality also means that these countries are very much dependent on the US and the West, because they don't have industry. All that this region of the world provides is pretty much cheap labor and raw commodities or resources to export up north. And so even though Latin America technically is not colonized, they continue to face what we call imperialism. And just an example of that is in 1821, you have the United States, who was only a country for 45 years or so, established what's called the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically, hey, any other European power, don't even think about sailing into our hemisphere, the Western hemisphere. Don't even think about going to Mexico, going to the Caribbean, going to Central America, going to Latin America, because that is our backyard. And if you try to do something fishy, we're going to police it. So here, since 1821, you have the United States proclaiming everything south of its border to be its domain and pretty much theirs. So it's important that we think about decolonization as a process of getting rid of a colonizer and also of enacting self-determination. And so this is important on a global scale, but also for the Chicano movement. And so it's important that we talk about decolonization because it really rises at the end of World War II with the independence of India, the People's Revolution in China in 1949, led by Mao Zedong. But it's important that we really conceive and think about that transition between World War II to the Cold War, to really think about the state of the third world during this time. And so when we learn about World War II, we're taught that there's a very clear bad guy. And that bad guy is Nazi Germany, without a doubt, and Hitler. And anyone that supported him is also bad. So that includes, and rightfully so, Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and also Imperial Japan. What we're not told, though, is the way that the Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, well, if they were fighting the bad guys, then they must be good. It's very easy to get trapped in a binary, this or that, black or white, as if they're two opposites. And so I really want us to think maybe differently about the ideologies at play during World War II. And I want to bring up a quote by a very important poet and politician by the name of Aimé Césaire. He was a poet that helped contribute and found the Negritude movement of basically Black Caribbean writers in the early, in the 1920s. And he wrote in his short, powerful, fiery book, Discourse on Colonialism, he's basically saying Adolf Hitler, his real crime was that he used the technologies of dehumanization and genocide against the white man, against Jews living in Europe, in Poland, in France. That was his real crime. Because before Hitler, those same technologies of murder were only used against colonial subjects, colonized peoples of the global South. So think King Leopold. King Leopold, when workers weren't working fast enough, he would authorize the cutting of their hands as punishment. This is systematic terror. But very few people criticize the crimes of colonialism, but they're so quick to call out Hitler. And Hitler is absolutely evil. There's no denying that. There's no denying the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews killed, the 6 million others killed as well. But this is not a simple binary of good versus bad, but rather the United States and the Allied powers, the supposedly good guys, were also engaged in acts of genocide themselves. Only that it was commit against dark-skinned peoples whose lives matter less, apparently. And so it's important to bring this up because after World War II, with the defeat of Nazi Germany, with the defeat of the Axis powers, what you see is the United States emerges relatively unscathed. Europe is destroyed, but the US emerges relatively unscathed, and has the desire to cement its status as global hegemon, as a superpower, as the sole dictator of economy, of politics. They want to cement capitalism as the global trade system, and their idea of democracy, whatever that means. But the US was not the only superpower to emerge from World War II. The Soviet Union, who was also an ally of the US, also emerged, but they had a very completely different outlook, and were also striving for the position of hegemon or superpower, sole superpower. And so we understand the Cold War to be a fight between the US and the Soviet Union. It was a Cold War. It was not a hot war. The US and the Soviet Union never went head to head. It was cold because instead, these ideological conflicts between capitalism and communism, they played out in other parts of the world. So you have Vietnam, you have Algeria, you have Chile, Guatemala, China, okay? Most countries across the world had experienced some sort of struggle for their people trying to get rid of their colonizers. And so there you see the US and Soviet Union sending in money and arms to try to influence the outcome. And so in this transition between the World War II to the Cold War, you have the United States realizes that the Soviet Union is a threat. And that's why during World War II, during Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, the United States withholds sending reinforcements to bail out the Soviet Union because they're hoping that the Nazis can kill as many Soviets as possible, to weaken the threat of the Soviet Union in the post-World War II period. And so what we see is the rise of the Cold War. Again, it's a Cold War. It's not actively hot, but you have now the United States and the Soviet Union attempting to expand its sphere of influence, to expand where their economic systems are being carried out. And so the Bandung Conference is very important because it represented over 54% of the world's population were represented at this conference. They were represented by 29 different governmental representatives from Asian and African nations who met to discuss peace and the role of the Third World in the Cold War, economic development, and decolonization. So they're saying, okay, we have this ideological conflict happening between the US and the Soviet Union, but what we care about is the countries like India, China, Indonesia that just achieved their independence for the first time and are struggling to survive, and where they decide to cooperate economically and culturally with one another. They commit to protecting human rights and the principle of self-determination, and they call for an end to racial discrimination wherever it occurred. And they reiterate the importance of peaceful coexistence, not going to war with any of the US or the Soviet Union. And so essentially, they're calling for, in a way, a politics of neutrality, saying we're not aligning ourselves to you all. But this is where the majority of the world's people are trying to figure out, how do we just survive? How do we proceed in this polarizing world where you have the US and the Soviet Union? What about the rest of us? So the Bandung Conference really brings people together, in this case, Asian and African nations. And so carrying on from that spirit of the Bandung Conference, we see the first 1961 non-aligned movement conference occur in Belgrade. And in this conference, you have the commitment to the non-aligned movement, meaning they are formally establishing their policy of non-alignment, and that we are concerned about our issues and issues of people of the global South, as you can see on this map. And so while they called for non-alignments, they were running into something of a contradiction. They said they did not want to align with the US or the Soviet Union, but at the same time, they cared about the struggles of other countries who have yet to decolonize. And so countries like Cuba then, who achieves their liberation in 1959, really pushed the non-aligned movement to, in a way, to commit more decisively to people's struggle. So just a note on terminology before we talk more about Cuba. We're already starting to throw out the terms third world. Third world makes us think then there's a first world, there's a second world. So this idea of dividing up the world into these terms came from a French demographer called Alfred Salvoy, who in 1952 offered this language to say the first world pretty much are all the highly industrialized countries that are allied with the West. So pretty much US and Western Europe. The second world are all those countries here that are part of the Soviet bloc. Think Slovenia, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Estonia, Russia. Okay, those will all be the second world. Now, the third world he's referring to is going to be pretty much all the other countries at the time. So hence, third world continues to be used to this day. But there's also other attempts to understand how we can think of dividing up the world. And so there's a school of theory called world systems theory that's very influenced by Marxist dependency thought and someone called Immanuel Wallerstein, who in the 1970s asked us to think of, okay, if the world exists as like a global trade network, and we need to think about how do we divide. We can think about this global trade network in terms of different categories. There are some categories of the world, which he called periphery, that are frankly, since their quote unquote discovery, have only been used as a source of cheap of raw materials, where they will provide sugar, spices, chocolate, rubber, gold, silver. These are the sites of those raw materials that you will then export to other regions. So that's what he calls the periphery. Periphery is the farthest away from something. Now, the core, on the other hand, is like the core of the earth or the core of an apple. It's at the very center. And it's the core that will receive those raw materials and will process them because they possess heavy industry, heavy machinery, they're industrialized. And so the core countries here will be the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. These are countries that possess the industry and the heavy machinery in order to turn, for example, rubber, say taken from the Congo. You can make a couple things with rubber. You can make the erasers on your pencils out of rubber, but also you can make tires out of rubber. But in the Congo, especially in the 1960s, they don't have manufacturing plants to create cars and assemble parts. Who does have manufacturing plants at that time are the industrialized countries, which is Western Europe and the US. So the raw materials will go from the periphery to the core where they will become manufactured and then sold to consumers in that global north up here. And also a few of them sold to the most wealthy in other parts of the world. And what we see as semi-periphery is kind of an in-between where they're starting to develop some type of industrialization and is being used as like a middle ground between core and periphery. And so it's important to think of the world in terms of economy because in fact, this can be thought of as what we call globalization or the world becoming connected. And while there's massive histories of trade, right? Like the Silk Road in Europe and Middle and Central Asia, or the spice trade in the Indian Ocean, or even trading routes along Abya Yala or the Americas. All that folks refer to as proto-globalization. So it's the most globalized networks that people had at the time. But once in 1492, the entire world was connected, new series of trade took place in what's called the Columbian Exchange, where we were saying chocolate, spices, horses, enslaved people, gold, silver, were all being traded now across the entire world. So it's important to think about trade globally and what facilitates the extraction of resources. How do you get rubber? How do you get silver? Through manual labor. So folks like Immanuel Wallerstein in world systems theory and dependency theory thinkers are really paying close attention to the role of race and labor on a world scale. And it's important that we continue to think like that, even within a Chicano Studies class, because Chicano Studies is interdisciplinary. That means that we're paying attention to history, politics, economics, migration, literature, and how we tell our stories. All of that is important. But as I'm arguing, Chicano Studies is also developing in relation to a lot of these other movements, and these are the theories that people are coming up with to understand global context. So just as you have the Chicano Studies students putting together the Plan de Aztlan and the Plan de Santa Barbara, which really gets at the crux of Chicano identity and the need for nationhood, there's also different struggles for self-determination occurring across the world. And that's going to take us to Cuba now. So what we were learning about is that during this time of the Cold War, you have the US and the Soviet Union really trying to spread its influence, capitalism and communism. But most of the world, the countries that were formerly colonized, trying to get free, that are just recently free or still struggling to get free, some of them become part of the non-aligned movement, but they're ultimately saying we need to not intervene. We can't intervene. But this is where you have Cuba do something entirely different. So Cuba, as a small island 50 miles off the shores of Florida, represented an extreme threat because at that time, the policy of the United States was containment. They're seeking to contain the spread of communism Let's keep it where it's at, keep it in China, keep it in the Soviet Union, do not let it spread. So that's why when communism was spreading to Vietnam, the US felt we need to go to Vietnam to put a halt to it. And before Vietnam, you had Korea and North Korea. And that's why the US sent their troops to Korea as well. So the policy of the United States at the time is containment, contain the spread, and we will send troops to fight and put down communist subversives in Korea, in Vietnam. Now, in Cuba, 50 miles off the coast of Florida, you have basically an island that is pretty much governed by the United States. The 1901 Platt Amendment pretty much stated that the United States has full authority to intervene into the political and economic affairs of the island. And so pretty much Cuba after 1901 developed into kind of like a gangster Las Vegas. And their ruler, dictator Fulgencio Batista, was in control and was basically extremely corrupt and literally just existing to benefit the United States. And so a lot of people were disgruntled with Fulgencio Batista. And it wasn't until Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and others sailed from Mexico City on the Granma ship, landed within Cuba, and began a guerrilla campaign. A guerrilla campaign is basically like hit and run assaults on like the Cuban military and the US soldiers that were there. So rather than two armies going to war all in one big battle, it was more like smaller numbers of people doing little hit and run attacks. And so for 2 years, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and others were able to build alliances and solidarity with local Cubanos. They were able to secure liberated zones where they built schools, hospitals, little manufacturing centers of shoes and belts and things like that. And were able to educate and build relationships with Cubanos who then said, oh yeah, we want to join your struggle. We want to join your revolutionary movement. And so finally in after 2 years, Cuba was able to secure independence from the United States. And so that's called the Cuban Revolution. It was very feared that Cuba would be another communist center. And that's why the United States was so concerned. Now, Fidel Castro pronounced Cuba to be at first a national independence movement, saying we're not communist. What we care about is just securing the independence of our country. And that was more tolerable from the eyes of the United States. But in 1961, Fidel Castro then said, you know what? Nope, we're actually Marxist-Leninist. Now, what does that mean? Marxism-Leninism is a theory of communism. Karl Marx is one of the founders of communism, alongside his other co-struggler, Friedrich Engels, an English person. Marx was German. And so these guys wrote the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx especially theorized the political and economic system of capitalism in his 3 books of Capital, volume 1, 2, and 3. And basically he's calling for, he's saying capitalism is doomed to fail because it's running workers into the ground, and that it is an inevitability that the workers, what he called the proletariat, will rise up, will overthrow the bosses, the bourgeoisie, and will create a worker society without any hierarchy, where everything they make is shared between them, and there is no private ownership of goods or the means of production. You have then Vladimir Lenin in the Soviet Union, before it is the Soviet Union, reading Marx, reading Engels, and figuring out how does this relate to the situation of peasants and workers in Russia, which at the time is led by Tsar Nicholas. And so within Russia, there's like a feudal economy, which means it's more farm workers. But what Lenin and others are able to do is overthrow the Tsar Nicholas, and ultimately, after the Menshevik Revolution, they implement the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which is basically now Lenin as the leader, his theories on how communism will be enacted. And it's a process, and for him, it involved a vanguard, which is a very uh like leadership class, a very educated class that's trained in Marxism, in theories of communism, and is going to lead that transition to ultimately a classless society. And so this is Marxism-Leninism. This is a very prominent and one of the main expressions of Marxism at this time. And this is the ideology that Cuba takes on. So Cuba could very easily have aligned itself with the non-aligned movement and say, nope, we're not going to take a side. But what they do instead is say, we experienced imperialism in our island. We need to develop socialism, because socialism, a predecessor to communism, that's the only way we can secure peace. That's the only way we can secure that people have access to housing, have access to health, have access to education, have access to community. Okay. So socialism is their way of creating a good society. And the only way to achieve socialism was not this theory of socialism in one state, which is basically, say, the Soviet Union attempting just consolidate its political project in one state. Cuba said, if we just focus on Cuba, we're gonna get strangled and die because we're an island, we're tiny. What the best thing that can help Cuba build out our socialist project on this island is by supporting the struggles of other countries that are still colonized to become free. And so what we see is that Cuba commits itself to the global revolution. So instead of being non-aligned, like the non-aligned movement or the Bandung conference, they push to radicalize those countries and say, no, we cannot just forget about our other siblings, our other countries that have yet to be free. We need to support them and we need to commit to socialism. So that's where you have Fidel Castro, for example. He sends Che to Bolivia, and he sends Che to the well, first he sends Che to the Congo. And this is important because in the Congo, you have this figure here, Patrice Lumumba, who was a democratically elected representative of the Congo, who is seeking to create change that will benefit the Congolese Black majority, to get rid of the Belgians. Remember King Leopold? But the Belgians and the US capture and kill King Leopold in 1964 because of the changes that he's making that threaten their power. And so after that experience, Che goes to the Congo in Central Africa to try and start a guerrilla war. He's not successful. He's not able to build relationships with the local peoples. And he writes about those frustrating experiences in his diary, the Congo Diaries. And so after that experience, he comes back to Cuba and then decides, nope, I want to focus on expanding revolution across Latin America. He's Argentinian. His goal was creating an Argentinian revolution, but he goes to Bolivia with the goal of overthrowing a US-backed dictator there, by building out a guerrilla campaign. Long story short, when he arrives in Bolivia with a team of 12 others, they don't receive the support from the Bolivian Communist Party that they hoped they would. They become under-resourced. Che also had terrible asthma, so he was unable to survive really in the humid jungles and the high altitudes. And Che gets captured and killed by US-trained Bolivian special forces in 1967. And so this is important because we see that Cuba is beginning to export its global ideology. And what we see when we see it really come together is at the Tri-Continental Conference between Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This is held in La Habana in 1966. But this is especially important because, again, unlike the Bandung Conference, unlike the non-aligned movement, you have Cuba convening countries of the third world, of the global south, in order to commit to revolution. And so in this experience as well, Cuba sends out they export the global revolution. They send soldiers to Angola and Mozambique, which are currently fighting, which at the time in the 60s and 70s were fighting wars against Portugal. Their guerrilla group was called Frelimo. Che gets sent to the Congo and Bolivia. And also Cuba sends medical brigades and teachers across the world to help under-resourced countries. And this, again, is just a poster of the organization of the people in struggle with Africa, Asia, Latin America. And so this is all important because we just reviewed a lot of different global struggles. We started with Vietnam, and then we talked about just the struggles for decolonization overall across the third world. And we also paid attention to the Chicano student activism. We touched a little bit on African-American struggles in the Black Panther Party, but we basically see all of this coalesce now in what we call the Third World Liberation Front. So the Third World Liberation Front is a student movement happening within California Bay Area, specifically on the campuses of San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. And so the Third World Liberation Front, much like the Plan de Santa Barbara in 1969, you have Plan de Santa Barbara, the Chicano students are making connections between the local and the global. Very similarly, students at these two campuses are making those same connections, and they're asking themselves, how do we support the Vietnamese people? How do we make life difficult for the United States empire? How do we honor our experiences as Black peoples, as Asian American peoples, as Chicano, Latino peoples, as Native American peoples? How do we advance our struggles, not just for equality and inclusion, but for self-determination of our communities and of our territories? And so the Third World Liberation Front is putting together all of this, and this is an expression of that global thinking. And so what you see is students at these campuses, they see their struggles in the US as connected to people's struggles globally. And what they do is they demand control of their educations, and they demand that in their schools, there be departments established that teach about these histories and that prepare students to go back to their communities where they can help build out the revolution, where they know about their history. They're trained in this way. And so ultimately what they demand is that they teach third world studies. And so the administrations of San Francisco State, of UC Berkeley, were not willing to give in to that demand. And so that's why you had students go on strike. And so this is called the Third World Strike. They go on strike for 2 years in order to secure the creation of these departments that ultimately would give rise to ethnic studies. And so ethnic studies at its core is a third world studies that looks at the histories, the experiences, the resistances, the ancestral ways of thinking, the relationship to territory of different peoples across the world. And so within ethnic studies, again, we have African American studies, Chicano studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies. You also have the rise of women and gender studies as well at the time. But these departments would not have been established were it not for student activism of Chicanos, of Black students, of Native American students, in order to demand that their histories, their experiences be reflected and taught in school, in their schools, that their histories should not just be an elective. This should be the core curriculum. The core curriculum should not just be white men. It should include people of color and women and queer people. And so what they're calling for is fundamentally a completely massive overhaul of the educational system that doesn't just serve to increase the career opportunities of one student so that then, oh, I'm gonna get a high-paying job and maybe I'll help my family out so that they'll improve. They're realizing that improvement actually means community betterment. It means lifting up the status of the entire community, not just of an individual. And that's pretty much the purpose of higher education in the United States. It sees progress and achievement on an individual basis where we become individualized. So as long as I get my degree and I obtain that high-paying job, I will take care of my immediate family and forget the rest. But what third world studies at its core seeks to do And the reason why it's such a threat is because it says we cannot forget our community. In fact, how is our community benefiting from the presence of this school here? How are students of color who are policed in schools, how can they find a valuable education in these spaces? And so that is the spirit of ethnic studies at its core. At its core, it was a third world studies against US empire. And there's a couple of films as well. One is called Decolonizing the University, which celebrates the 40th anniversary, I want to say, of the strike at UC Berkeley, and also a film called On Strike, 1969 to 1999, which talks about the state of the ethnic studies program at UC Berkeley and how the program has continued to face challenges and setbacks. So there have been some pretty remarkable achievements as a result of the student activism of the 1960s. Certainly one was that Chicano student activism in the 60s led to the creation of over 160 different Chicano and Latino studies departments afterwards. Similarly, other Black studies, women's and gender studies, Native American studies programs were created, where finally there were, as public institutions, there was money allocated to pay for full-time teachers to teach these courses, and provide this education to decades of students. However, with the 1980s, the rise of Reagan and the rise of neoliberal austerity economic measures, what that all refers to is basically privatization. How do we get the government to spend less and get private companies to play that role? So now, if healthcare becomes privatized, it means that ultimately what dictates the success of a private company? The amount of money they make. So profit is the number one goal under neoliberalism. So similarly, under austerity and the cutting back, the budget cuts, in other words, you see which are the first programs to go? Ethnic studies. So while the Third World Strike helped to establish the first ethnic studies programs for students to receive a relevant education rooted in solidarity and justice, these very programs became victims to neoliberal budget cuts that say this education is actually less and less important, less and less relevant. And in the case that the university talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is not necessarily to call out imperialism or the way that the United States is moving in the world. It is basically just, and it's important to increase the number of people of color in institutions. But what these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, DEI, what they leave out is the fact that what does it mean to bring in students of color, first-gen students, into a school space that continues to be racist? And so there's something to be said about increasing resources and support for first-gen students, providing legal services as well on campus, maintaining free tuition. That's pretty much rare outside the LA College Promise program. But these universities begin to hijack ethnic studies and say, oh, it's just about getting people of color in the room, and it turns into a multiculturalism. Let's learn about the heroes, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, and let's talk about the holidays. But what's lost in that is the longer critiques and analysis that our peoples have created, such as the Plan de Aztlán, the Plan de Santa Barbara, where they lay out, why did we have to do this? What were we experiencing that made us demand these things? That made us call out the way the US is working in the world? Because if we are to think and ask critical questions about how the US is operating in the world, it would necessarily mean that we ask, why is the US sending and signing off arms deals with Israel while it's killing tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza? So neoliberal multiculturalism, bringing people of color into a room, does not want us to ask these questions, because these types of questions means, again, challenging the basis of these institutions and their power. and the people who control them. And I think the situation about student activism with Palestine is too relevant a point. This past school year, last year, approaching 1 year of genocide of Gaza, students have bravely come together to create encampments from places like UCLA to Cal State LA to Columbia University in New York, to Tufts University, where I got my undergrad. Students saying, we're going to shut this down. We're going to walk out of campus. We're going to refuse to sit in because we need to make sure that our university cuts all ties with Israel, because Israel is actively committing a genocide. That means that we need to cut all study abroad programs in Israel. We need to make sure that our universities are not invested in any of the companies benefiting from a genocide in Palestine. That includes technology firms like Microsoft, Boeing, Google even. These are all companies that are invested in developing technologies to surveil Palestinians across Palestine, across the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem. And you have these students advocating for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS. Boycott these institutions, divest from institutions that are profiting from genocide, and sanction Israel. Make it difficult for them to trade. Use those peaceful protesting tools, much like you did with South Africa and apartheid there, in order to get Israel to stop and to prevent any more needless death of any Palestinian. And so what we're seeing is that while students who are participating in these encampments, they are embodying, they are today's carrying on the tradition of third world studies. And yet students, faculty, and staff that support a free Palestine, an end to apartheid, are being met with, they're being expelled from school, they're being arrested by their university police and sent to jail with fines, and some of the faculty are losing their work and are being silenced because of it. So ethnic studies is in a very critical stage in this moment, where the entire spirit of ethnic studies is at a crossroads between going down a multicultural route that loves people of color but doesn't care about what we stand for, and the actual struggle of fighting power, of fighting for justice in a university space, in our communities. And it's the latter that really embodies what Chicano and ethnic studies is about. It has been about inclusion, but it's always been for justice. And so in today's presentation, we discussed the rise of Chicano student activism from the early 1900s to the heyday of the 1960s. That included East LA walkouts, the Denver conference and the creation of the Plan That's Land, and the Santa Barbara conference and the plan there, and how that led to the creation of Mecha. But a big takeaway is that Chicano students, while they were importantly thinking deeply and concretely about their experiences as Chicanos living within occupied Aztlan, and developing this idea of Chicano nationalism and self-determination as their pathway towards justice, which included the fight for higher education, this thinking about Chicano self-determination is being influenced by other movements for self-determination occurring within the United States, with groups like the Black Panthers and the Third World Liberation Front, and also the efforts of peoples across the entire world. In particular, colonized countries seeking to get rid of those colonizers and to have the opportunity to get control over the land, the resources, their own communities for the first time. And so, while the rise of Chicano studies has its own specific history, Chicano student activism flowered within and was shaped by a broader anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggle for the self-determination of global oppressed peoples. As oppressed and occupied peoples themselves, Chicana, Chicano, Chicane activists connected their struggles to those around them and built lasting movements in the decades to come. Thank you, everyone. This was our presentation. There's going to be some readings and just supplemental materials to build on the themes that we've been exploring here. And there's a lot. There is so much that we jam-packed into this, but I hope it can be a launching pad for continued exploration and engagement with these themes, whether it be within the Chicano student activism or the third world context that the Chicano movement was very much grounded within. So, hasta la próxima. Thank you.